The spotlight hit James Brown's face at exactly the moment the police knocked on his dressing room door 3 floors below the stage. He couldn't hear the knock. No one on stage could hear anything except the deafening roar of the crowd, the punch of the horns, the snap of the drums. James was in the zone, that sacred space where his body moved faster than his thoughts, where every scream and every spin felt like an exorcism, like he was purging something poisonous from his soul through sheer physical expression. He had no idea that while he was performing a routine he'd perfected over 40 years, his wife was sitting in a car outside the venue, phone pressed to her ear, giving police officers permission to break into the one room James considered untouchable. The dressing room wasn't just a place where he changed clothes. It was a sanctuary. It was where he prepared the mask he showed the world, where he locked away everything that contradicted the image of control, power, and invincibility. But masks only work when no one looks behind them. And on this night in Atlanta, with James still on stage believing he was invincible, 3 officers were about to look behind the mask and find a truth that would end a marriage, expose a secret, and prove that even gods bleed when you cut them deep enough. If you want to discover the untold stories behind music's greatest legends, make sure to subscribe right now. You won't want to miss what happens next. To understand why this moment shattered James Brown so completely, you have to go back to the beginning, to a 4-year-old boy standing in a doorway in Barnwell, South Carolina, watching his mother walk away without looking back. The year was 1937, and the Depression had already stripped most black families down to the bone. But this wasn't about money. This was about something deeper, something that burned itself into James's memory with such intensity that 40 years later, he could still describe the exact color of her dress, the sound of her shoes on the gravel, the way the morning light caught her hair as she disappeared around the corner. She never said goodbye. She never explained. She just left. And in that silence, a wound opened inside James that never properly healed, that instead calcified into something hard and impenetrable. A shell he built around himself brick by brick, performance by performance, until the shell became so thick that people forgot there was ever a vulnerable boy underneath. The abandonment taught him a lesson he carried into every relationship, every performance, every moment of his life. Trust no one completely. Reveal nothing that can be used against you. And above all, maintain absolute control over your environment. Because the moment you let your guard down, the moment you let someone see the real you, they will leave. The shell he built was reinforced by every hardship that followed. He picked cotton in the Georgia heat, shined shoes on street corners, served time in juvenile detention for stealing clothes because he wanted to look presentable, wanted to be something more than the abandoned kid everyone pitied. When he discovered music, when he found he could make people feel things with his voice, it wasn't just a career opportunity. It was armor. On stage, he wasn't the boy his mother didn't want. He was James Brown, the hardest working man in show business. A title he gave himself not out of arrogance, but out of necessity, because working that hard meant never having time to think about the parts of himself he'd buried, never having to face the question that haunted him in quiet moments. What was so wrong with me that my own mother couldn't stay? By 1962, James had transformed himself into something unprecedented in American music. The Live at the Apollo album captured a performance so electric, so viscerally powerful, that it forced the music industry to recognize what black audiences had known for years. James Brown wasn't just another rhythm and blues singer. He was a phenomenon, a force of nature who could hold a crowd of 3,000 people in complete thrall for 90 minutes without a single break, building and building until the final moments of "Please, please, please," when he would collapse to his knees, apparently spent, only to have Bobby Bird drape the famous cape over his shoulders and help him toward the wings. But then, just as the audience thought the show was over, James would shrug off the cape and return to the microphone, resurrected, pleading one more time with a desperation that felt painfully real, because, in a way, it was. The cape routine wasn't just showmanship. It was a metaphor for James's entire existence, the constant cycle of collapse and resurrection, vulnerability and strength, the man behind the mask and the god the audience needed him to be. But what the audience never saw was the price James paid for those transformations. Backstage after shows, his knees would be bleeding through the bandages. His voice would be shredded to the point where he could barely speak. His hands would shake from the adrenaline crash. And he would sit alone in his dressing room, not celebrating, but preparing for the next show, because stopping meant thinking. And thinking meant feeling. And feeling meant confronting all the things he'd been running from since he was 4 years old. The work wasn't just his identity. It was his anesthetic, his way of staying ahead of the pain that was always chasing him. Then came 1965, and with it, a musical innovation that would reshape American music forever, but would also accelerate James's spiral in ways he couldn't have predicted. Papa's Got a Brand New Bag was unlike anything that had come before it, a song built not on melody or chord progressions, but on rhythm, on the harsh emphasis of the first beat. What musicians would come to call the one. It was funk, a word that didn't even exist yet to describe what James had created, and it was revolutionary because it prioritized the body over the mind, movement over contemplation. James had found a way to make music that matched his philosophy of life. Don't think, don't feel, just move, just work. Just keep pushing forward with such relentless intensity that nothing can catch you. The innovation made him a legend, earned him the title Godfather of Soul, and established him as one of the most influential musicians in history. But it also trapped him in a prison of his own creation, because once you've built your entire identity around constant motion, around never stopping, you can't ever afford to be vulnerable. The success brought money, fame, influence, everything James had dreamed of when he was shining shoes in Georgia. But it also brought isolation, because the higher he climbed, the more people he had to keep at arm's length, the more he had to maintain the image of invincibility. So when the relationships came, he couldn't let them get too close. He would marry 4 times, each marriage following a similar pattern. Intense attraction, rapid commitment, a brief period where he would let his guard down just slightly. And then the inevitable pulling back. The reassertion of control, the transformation of love into something more like ownership, because ownership was safer than vulnerability, control was safer than trust, and being alone was safer than risking the kind of abandonment that had defined his childhood. But the armor he'd built to protect himself from pain was also preventing him from experiencing genuine connection. And that absence of connection was creating a different kind of pain. A loneliness so profound that by the early 1980s, he was medicating it with pills and powder, substances that promised to fill the void where human intimacy should have been. The addiction crept up slowly, professionally hidden because James Brown didn't do anything that wasn't perfect, that wasn't controlled, that wasn't carefully managed for public consumption. He still performed with the same intensity. He still demanded perfection from his band. He still projected the image of the Godfather, untouchable and indomitable. But privately, in those dressing rooms he kept locked even from the people closest to him, he was unraveling, using chemicals to manufacture the feeling of peace he'd never learned to create through actual human connection. Then he met Adrienne Rodriguez, and for one dangerous moment, James thought he might have found someone who could reach through the armor. Adrienne was different from his previous wives. fiercer, less willing to be controlled, more insistent on being treated as an equal partner. And James, perhaps sensing that this might be his last chance at real intimacy, led her closer than he'd let anyone since his mother left. They married in 1984, and for the first few years, their relationship provided James with something he'd never had: a home that felt safe, a person who knew his secrets, and stayed anyway. But the problem with letting someone that close is that they can see everything, including the parts of you that are still sick, still damaged, still ruled by wounds that happened half a century ago. The relationship that had started as James's best chance at healing became instead a mirror that reflected back everything he hated about himself. Every weakness, every failure, every moment when the God act slipped and revealed the frightened man underneath. And when people can see your weaknesses, when they know where you're vulnerable, there are two options: let them help you heal, or hurt them before they can hurt you. James chose the latter. The fight started small: disagreements about money or scheduling or the amount of time James spent working. But they escalated quickly because James had never learned to fight fair, to argue without trying to dominate. What Adrienne experienced in those years was the full force of a man who had spent his entire life refusing to be vulnerable, refusing to admit fault, refusing to let anyone see him as anything less than completely in control. And when the drugs made him paranoid, when the pills and powder convinced him that Adrienne was plotting against him, the fights turned physical because violence was the ultimate expression of control, the final way James knew to reassert dominance when everything else had failed. Which brings us back to that night in Atlanta, to James on stage performing with everything he had, believing he was untouchable because he was on stage, and on stage he was God. But 3 floors below, in the dressing room he considered sacred, police officers were discovering what Adrienne had finally decided to expose. The pills, the powder, the paraphernalia, all the things James had kept hidden for years because revealing them would mean admitting vulnerability. When the show ended, when James came off stage still riding the high of the performance, still believing he was invincible, he walked into his dressing room to find 3 police officers standing among the wreckage of his carefully constructed privacy. And in that moment, everything he'd built over 6 decades, the entire fortress of control and perfection and godlike invincibility, came crashing down because the one thing he'd feared more than anything, exposure, vulnerability, having his secrets revealed to a world that expected him to be superhuman, was happening, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The mask cracked. The God bled. And James Brown, the hardest working man in show business, stood in his own dressing room and felt, perhaps for the first time since he was 4 years old, watching his mother walk away, completely and utterly powerless. The arrest made headlines. The drugs, the domestic violence allegations, the whole ugly truth came spilling out in police reports and court documents. James was sentenced to 6 years in prison, though he would serve less than 3. But the real sentence, the one that hurt more than any prison term, was the exposure itself. The public knowledge that James Brown, who had built an entire identity around being unbreakable, had broken. James Brown died on Christmas Day 2006. His body finally giving out after 83 years of relentless motion, of refusing to stop, of running from a 4-year-old's wound that never healed. But here's the strange epilogue to this story, the part that complicates any simple narrative about a man destroyed by his demons. James's musical legacy survived everything: the arrests, the scandals, the ugly truths that came out in his final years. Funky Drummer, the breakbeat he recorded in 1970, became the most sampled rhythm in hip-hop history. The Payback, Sex Machine, Papa's Got a Brand New Bag. These songs didn't just influence music. They became the foundation of entire genres. Every rapper who ever emphasized the first beat, every producer who ever built a track around rhythm rather than melody, they're all James Brown's children, carrying forward the innovation he created while running from his pain. And maybe that's the real tragedy, or maybe it's the real triumph. That a man so broken, so damaged, so unable to heal his own wounds, could create something so powerful that it would outlive him by generations. That the armor he built to protect himself became the same instrument through which he changed the world. In 2021, 15 years after his death, James's estate finally settled the legal battles over his will. The settlement directed that James's assets would fund educational scholarships for underprivileged children in South Carolina and Georgia. Kids who, like James, were starting from nothing, were fighting against systems designed to keep them down, were looking for a way out through talent and work and refusal to quit. Maybe the lesson isn't that pain makes you stronger, or that trauma creates genius, or any of the other comfortable lies we tell ourselves about suffering. Maybe the lesson is simpler and sadder, and somehow more hopeful. That you can be completely broken and still create beauty. That you can be running from your demons and still change the world. That you can fail at love and intimacy and vulnerability and still leave behind something that matters. James Brown never healed, but his music helps others heal. And in the end, maybe that's the only resurrection that matters. Not the cape routine, not the performance of invincibility, but the genuine legacy that survives when all the masks have finally cracked and fallen away, revealing the truth underneath. That even wounded people can create miracles. That even broken souls can change the world. That the boy abandoned in Barnwell in 1937 grew up to give voice to millions who felt just as abandoned, just as powerless, just as desperate to prove they mattered. The stage lights have gone dark, the cape has been folded away. But the beat, that revolutionary emphasis on the one, still echoes. Through every song on every radio, proof that James Brown, for all his flaws and failures and inability to save himself, saved the one thing that mattered most: the music. And the music never dies.